Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. Today we're going to talk about the most popular, fastest growing, from what I hear in the Western world, worldview. It's called secular humanism. And before I even really get into the heart of it, I just want to say it's hard not to have a lot of sympathy for that view, which basically is that it's up to us as human beings to make the world a better place. But let me say right off the bat that I agree with that, maybe for different reasons, but I do agree that it's up to us as human beings, that we are mandated by God to be His image bearers, made in the likeness of God in His image, that it is up to us and our responsibility to make the world a better place. And I would also agree we haven't done a great job with that. Maybe I would agree we've done a terrible job with that. On previous programs, we have talked about the idea of worldview requirements. For something to be true, it needs to, or something be relevant and true, it needs to have some requirements. First of all, to be relevant to us as human beings, it has to answer 4 questions. A worldview has to tell us, give us some explanation of where we've come from. Why, or what are we doing here? Why is there something rather than nothing? Which is supposedly the most basic philosophical question. Secondly, a worldview is going to explain the meaning of our existence, if there is any meaning. Now, secular humanism might say that we have to make our own meaning. There's no intrinsic meaning for our being here, so we have to make our own meaning. Okay, well and good. But it does have some relevance because it does have an answer to that question. I wouldn't agree with the answer to the question, but at least it has one. The third requirement for a worldview to be, or not requirement, but the third question that every worldview answers would be, is there any way that we ought to live then? Based on our purpose for being here, is there any morality? We're talking about morality, or is there any way we should live? Well, secular humanism has an answer for that. Yes, we should be good people. Now, that definition gets a little squirrely because there's not much foundation for it on secular humanism, but they still have an answer. We should be good. And so the final question is, most worldviews have an answer for this. What happens when we die? That's just, you can't be a human being and not wonder about that. You might think nothing happens when you die. You cease to exist. You go into oblivion. That's still an answer to that question. I would disagree with that as well, but that's the answer of secular humanism. So every worldview answers those 4 questions, but to be acceptable, the answers to those questions have to meet, I think, 4 requirements. First of all, they have to correspond in some way to the way that we live, to what it means to be a human being. And I think secular humanism, by and large, does correspond. It's talking about making the world a better place, gives us a reason to be here. It talks about respecting each other. So, yeah, I think it does meet that requirement of just corresponding to what it means to be a human being. The second requirement that I would say is evidence. There ought to be some evidence to support it. And I think you could probably drum up some evidence to support the worldview of secular humanism based on its presuppositions that we'll talk about in a few minutes. The third requirement is what I want to talk about today. There are actually 4, but I'm only going to, for the sake of time, focus in on this one. It's called coherence, which means that a worldview cannot, if it's true, it cannot be self-contradictory. It has to obey the law of non-contradiction, which is one of the 3 basic laws of logic. And it's inescapable. Even if you don't believe in the law of non-contradiction, you have to use it to deny it. All it says, we use it every day, all the time, we just don't identify it as such. The law of non-contradiction, by the way, I welcome you to look it up on Wikipedia, and here's what it'll tell you. It says, the law of non-contradiction states that contradictory propositions cannot both be true. My favorite movie is Fiddler on the Roof. And in this movie, Reptevia, the principal character of the movie, he's talking to a couple of guys. There's actually a group of Jewish men standing around in early 19th century or early 20th century Russia, before the revolution, and they're all standing around a small village. And one guy says something, and Reb Tevye says, "You're right." Another guy says exactly the opposite, and Reb Tevye says, "You're right." And the third guy, another guy is talking and says, wait a minute. You say he's right, you say he's right. They can't both be right. To which Reb Tevye says, "You're also right." Well, it's just making fun of or using the law of non-contradiction to make some really, really cool humor, I think. The bottom line is this: all truth has to fit together. It has to live in the same house. They can't be contradictory. So for a worldview to be relevant, it has to be coherent. It can't be self-contradictory. I'm going to tell you how secular humanism is. Keep watching. This will really help you understand where I'm headed here. There are three ways in which a proposition, or two propositions, let's say, can be self-refuting or self-contradictory. The first way is just by definition. In other words, if the statement is true, it's false. It negates itself simply in its proposal. For example, all truth is relative. You hear that a lot. But it's self-refuting, because if all truth, when you say that all truth, now you're talking about objective. No matter what you think, all truth is relative. Well, if all truth is relative, then the truth, all truth is relative, is also relative, and it becomes meaningless. So it's false by definition. If it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's false. That's the simplest way. It's like saying there is no sentence that has more than three words. Well, just by saying the sentence, you've defeated what you've said about the sentence. So that's the most common way, let's say. The second way that things can be self-contradictory is a little more subtle, but I think it's even more profound. It's when the person making the proposition must assume a position that his proposition denies can exist. I want to make sure you follow this, because this is fun stuff for me. If something is self-refuting, then the person saying it must assume a position in order to make his statement that his statement denies can exist. It's kind of like saying, I'm going to climb this tree to get to the place where I can say that no trees exist. Maybe better, I'm going to cut the tree down before I climb it. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. Postmodernism, which is a very, very prevalent worldview today, says this: there is no overarching truth. Nothing is really true whether you believe it or not. The only truth that exists, it's kind of like all truth is relative, but they would say more is all truth is subjective to the person saying it. It's the whole idea of, okay, that may be true for you, but it's not true for me. Now, along with that, the postmodern view is that every truth claim, every claim of objective truth, is nothing more than a grab for power. If I think I'm right and I think you're wrong, then I'm trying to grab power and have authority over you for some reason, and I'm going to abuse that, and that's caused all the wars in the 20th century. And certainly there's some truth in that. But here's the problem. If I'm the one proposing that idea, that all truth is just a grab for power, what about me? I just made a truth claim. Am I grabbing for power by making that claim? Well, obviously not. So my position as the speaker, as the proposer of that, refutes what I'm saying. It's not, all truth claims are not a grab for power. They could be, but all truth claims aren't automatically that. That's the second way that things can be self-refuting. The third way is the way I want to talk about today, and I'm going to call it, the Latin name in logic is called a non sequitur, which means it doesn't follow. Arguments start with propositions or premises, we would call them. So if this is true and that is true, then something else must be true. So you have premises and a conclusion. So a non sequitur is when the conclusion does not follow from the premises. Doesn't follow. So it contradicts itself in that case. And the thing that I want to emphasize to you before we get into the heart of this thing is, something that's self-refuting or is self-contradictory or is logically flawed cannot be true. And so that's why we go back to the whole idea of every worldview has to pass these tests, including Christianity. In a similar way, just like every worldview has to talk about the problem of evil, not just Christianity. We're not the only ones who have to explain why there's so much evil in the world. Every worldview has to explain that. So every worldview has to have some coherence. It can't be self-contradictory. So what we want to do is look at the worldview of secular humanism, which is the fastest growing, and obviously, even from my standpoint, I have the most sympathy for this worldview because it correlates so much to the Christian worldview. So I want to show you why. Keep watching. I'm going to read you from the Secular Humanist Manifesto. This is the latest one, by the way. I think there are 3 of them. You can go to Wikipedia and look up secular humanism and go to the 3rd manifesto and read. We can read all of them for that matter. But I'm going to read you a part of one to show you from their standpoint what secular humanism is. Humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that, without supernaturalism, affirms our ability and our responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. The life stance of humanism, guided by reason, inspired by compassion, and informed by experience, encourages us to live life well and fully. It evolved through the ages and continues to develop through the efforts of thoughtful people who recognize that values and ideals, however carefully wrought, are subject to change as our knowledge and understandings advance. Wow, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Except for a couple of phrases in there that I want to dig into a little bit more. The first one says it's progressive. It's a progressive philosophy, which means we're making progress. First question we might want to ask is progress toward what? If you use that terminology, you're making progress, you ought to have some goal in mind. The second phrase I would draw your attention to is without supernaturalism, which means that secular humanism is a philosophy of naturalism / materialism. What I mean by that is that there are no supernatural forces. Of course, that means there is no God. There's nothing supernatural about us. Everything is natural. The only thing that actually exists is matter, material itself, and all matter can only respond to the laws of nature. So everything has to be explained in terms of the laws of nature because there is no other source of explanation if you're a naturalist. So that's the premises of secular humanism is naturalism, materialism, we'll say anti or non-supernaturalism. And all those 3 basically are the same thing. Let me read you something else. This is the Young Atheist's Handbook. Interesting, but I have to like the guy that wrote this. The author is a guy named Alam Shea, which is, I'm not sure where he's from, but here's what he says. Despite not believing in God and not believing in an afterlife where I might be rewarded or punished for my behavior, I try to be a good person. That's the most any of us can do. Well, of course I'm not an atheist, but for an atheist to say that, I have to say, yeah. I mean, I think I'd take his word for it. He's trying to be a good person. And not only that, he has a little bragging right, because what he's saying is, when an atheist is good, he's really better than me when I'm good, because I'm being good because I think I'm going to be in big trouble in the afterlife if I'm not good. Whereas he has pure motives. He's only being good because it's good. Okay? Why is that self-refuting then? Let me introduce you to a gentleman by the name of John Gray. He's retired now, and he's not one of the new atheists, but he is a very strong atheist and a very brilliant. He was an economics professor and a philosophy professor, philosophy of economics, of course, but a very strong atheist who absolutely, I don't need to resort to Christians to criticize the logical implausibility of secular humanism, because John Gray does a much better job than I could ever do. Here's what he says. Secular humanism is based on two Christian myths. One is that there is such a thing as moral progress. Now, what does he mean? He said that's a myth. There's no such thing as moral progress. Well, why does he say that? Because as an atheist, he is also a strict materialist and a naturalist, which means that everything happens according to natural laws. Well, natural law is not moral in nature. It's not progressive in nature. There is no goal. Nature doesn't have a goal. It may seem like that to people who are evolutionists because things seem to get more complex, but there is no purpose or goal behind nature. There's no reason for us to be here. If secular humanism has to answer that question, is there a reason for us to be here? No reason at all. It can't then, according to John Gray, turn around and say, but we're making progress towards our goal. Well, if you can make up your own goals, that works. But according to John Gray, number one, there's no such thing as moral progress because there is no such thing as morality. Why is there no such thing as morality? Because on true, strict naturalism and materialism, nothing happens by choice. There is no free will. We do what we do because we're wired that way by the random processes of nature, and since there is nothing else but nature, there's no other explanation for it. So we're going to do what we're driven to do, regardless of our entreaties about morality and doing the right thing. As a matter of fact, what John Gray says is troubling. He says morality is nothing more than a convenience for normal time. But let me give you the example that he gives to show that. He says during World War II, in the Holocaust, in a concentration camp, a young boy was raped by a Nazi guard. And the young boy lived, and the reason we know this happened is because he wrote about it. But the way the young boy lived was that in the process of him being raped, he lost his cap. Well, on the morning roll call, if you did not have your cap when everybody lined up, immediately you were shot. One bullet in the back of the head. There was a war on. They had to save ammunition. No questions asked. So that young boy knew that obviously it would have done him no good to try to tell on the guy who raped him. And he lost his cap, so he knew he was going to be killed the next day anyway. So he stole the cap from another boy, put it on his head, so now there's somebody else who has no cap in the morning roll call. And he said, in his own book, he said, I couldn't wait for it to be over. I counted the seconds. Nobody said anything. They just walked down the aisle, checking those people, and suddenly there was a shot in the back of the head. He was dead, and I was happy to be alive. So what John Gray says is, who was more moral? If human life is precious, then who did the right thing? What was this guy that saved his life by stealing the cap? Was he doing the right thing to save his own precious life, or should he have forfeited his precious life to save the precious life of somebody down at the other end of the road? Well, what he says is that morality is just a convenience. We teach our children morality, he said, and we talk about doing the right thing because it makes them easier to live with, easier to raise. But in not normal times, all that goes out the window. Well, I just want to make a parenthetical thought here. As a Christian, I think he has a point, I'm afraid. If as Christians our morality is nothing more than a convenience for normal times to make our life easier, I don't want somebody stealing my stuff. I don't want anybody hurting me. Well, he's got a point, doesn't he? But I want to just make this point. It's a little bit parenthetical here. The Christian view of morality is not convenient at all. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. Jesus said all the law is summed up in two commands: that we love God with all of our heart, our soul, our mind, and our strength, and that we love our neighbor as ourself. Jesus is the ultimate good neighbor in that he is the epitome. He's the ultimate. Inconvenience is hardly describes what he did for us. As his neighbors, he took on our sin. He paid the penalty for us by dying on the cross to pay for our sins because he loves us as he loves himself. That's Christian morality. So it's hardly convenient, and yet we'd have to say that especially in the Western church, that's what it looks like a lot. It looks like us just being convenient. And I just want to make that thought parenthetical. I hope John Gray is not right about my morality, but I think he is right about morality in general. It does not exist and cannot exist in the secular worldview. So the idea that we're making moral progress, we can be better, is in itself a myth. Now, what John Gray says is that the secular humanists, where'd they get that idea of making moral progress? Well, the only worldview that allows for making moral progress is Christianity. And what John Gray says is this, that Christians, although he, of course, violently disagrees with us, he says they can be forgiven at least to believe in morality because they believe that, here's the other myth, that humans are special because they're made in the image of God. So at the very least, if that's my premise, that we are God's creation and we are made in the image of God, and we are to be his image bearers, then it's not a non sequitur. It actually does follow that it is our responsibility then to make the world a better place. And it does follow that we can make moral progress because we're made in the image of God, and even though that image has been damaged in the fall, we can make moral progress toward that as followers of Christ. And not only that, we have a standard of goodness defined outside of us by God that we can make progress toward. In other words, we have a goal, a purpose. But none of that can exist in the secular humanist premises because their premise, their foundation is materialism. So, but without that foundation, they simply become a watered down Christianity. That's the problem. The other thing I want to talk about here is the idea that the other scary thing about secular humanism is they talk about the greater good. And so I think when you hear that term, the greater good, you need to hitch up your britches and run as fast as you can, and I'll tell you why. When secular humanism talks about the greater good, they mean well. They certainly do. And my problem with that is, whose greater good are we talking about? Secular humanism is all about ethical lives and responsibility and the greater good, but so was Nazi Germany. It was all about the greater good. The Holocaust, from the Nazi standpoint, was about the greater good. Stalinism, in which we don't know how many, 17, 20 million, probably more, lost their lives for the greater good under Stalin. Maoism, same thing. Millions, we're talking millions of people lost their lives for the greater good, as those people in authority saw it. So the problem with secular humanism is, by whose authority do we establish the greater good? Well, I hope you see, I just want to backtrack a little bit. Secular humanism has all kinds of problems, even though it sounds great, even though I'd rather somebody be a secular humanist than a criminal, even though because they believe in goodness, they believe in doing things right, they want to live ethical lives to their fullest. Well, I'm all for all that stuff too. We just have a different foundation. I don't think the foundation of their materialism, it's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow that moral progress exists. It doesn't follow that humans are something special. And as John Gray says, those are Christian ideas that secular humanism has to borrow in order to be Secular humanism. One guy said it this way, that secular humanism is a weed growing in ground that has been plowed by Christianity. That's a little harsh, but I thought I'd bring it up anyway. I want to read you, kind of in conclusion here, a quote from one of the leading ethical minds, and maybe a secular humanist. He's a law professor at Yale University. His name is Arthur Leff. And here's what he says. He says, only if ethics were something unspeakable by us could law be unnatural and therefore unchallengeable. Because he says every ethical claim is actually a claim of authority. So when somebody says you ought to do this, we ought to make moral progress, here's the goal, this is what you should do, it's a claim of authority. Well, obviously the greater good then is by whose authority are we talking about? So that's what Arthur Leff is talking about. And so he says, as things stand now, everything is up for grabs. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. Those who stood up to and died resisting Hitler, Stalin, Amin, and Pol Pot, and General Custer too, have earned salvation. I might disagree with that a little bit, but I'm very sympathetic to what he's saying. Those who acquiesced to the above named Hitler, Pol Pot, etc., those who acquiesced, those who cooperated with the greater good proposed by those people ought to be damned. Wow. There is in the world such a thing as evil. And then he says, altogether now, says who? By whose authority do we say that your greater good is evil and my greater good is good? If there's no objective, transcendent moral standard, then there is no foundation for progressive morality. That's where secular humanism is a non sequitur, and I will make this contention that Christianity is coherent because we believe that God's by nature is good. It's not that God commands good because it's already good, or that anything God commands is good. It's that God himself is good and the standard of our morality. Thanks for watching.